In Project 3, we're going to take a look at the pivot table and the pivot chart feature. And at the bottom of page 116, it tells us that a pivot table is an interactive table that organizes and summarizes data that's based on category labels that you designate from rows and column headings. And then a numeric column, if you select that, that's grouped by the row and column category, and the data is summarized using a function like sum, average, or count. And these pivot tables are particularly useful for management since they can analyze the data in a variety of scenarios. They can filter a row or column category and instantly see those changes being made. Also, the interactivity of the pivot table allows one to examine a variety of scenarios with just a few clicks. And that's where you get the name pivot table. You can pivot rows and columns to different areas and immediately see the results of how that affects an overall summary. At the top of page 117, they list some questions that you would want to ask yourself before you created a pivot table. So you may want to read through those, just familiarize yourself with some of those items before actually creating a pivot table. At the bottom of page 117, they show you what the layout's going to look like for a pivot table, and we'll go through that in Project 3A. And then at the top of page 118, the information that you see there, this is kind of what we're working towards. We eventually want to summarize the fitness equipment for the various regions and by salespersons. So the model or the equipment, fitness equipment, will be, you can see that in the model in A1. You'll get a better understanding of that once we go through the exercise. So in Project 3A, they've asked us to open the Premium Fitness January sales and save it as Excel Level 2, blah, blah, blah. So, and I have not done that, but just keep in mind, as I mentioned before, if you want to keep your original intact, you do need to save it under a new name. Okay, so we are going to summarize. We're going to create a pivot table that will summarize the fitness equipment. Okay, and it's going to actually be by model number, but the fitness equipment by region and by salesperson. So we're going to see regions and salesperson. If you notice here too, I mean, this is a lot of data and it's kind of hard to filter through and understand what's going on. So a pivot table helps kind of, I'm going to use the word consolidate, but kind of minimize it and compact it so that we can understand it a little bit better. So to create a pivot table, you just want to make sure that you're somewhere inside the area that contains the data. They have named this area A4 through G, whatever it is, G47. If you go to the name box, January sales, they have named that area, so we'll probably see that popping up. But to create it, you just want to make sure that you're inside this area. And then we'll go to the Insert tab. In the Tables group, you'll see Pivot Table. And we do want to click on the bottom portion of that first so that you can see that there are two options under that button, the pivot table and the pivot chart. So we'll look at both of those, but for the first one we want to go to pivot table. And if you'll notice, if you don't select beforehand, it'll take the entire area that you're within because we don't have a space between the titles and where the column headings begin. So you'll notice that range is not correct. It really needs to start with 4, or if you type in the name of the range, which is Jan sales, you could put that in there as well. What I'm going to opt to do for now is just click in my text box and change the 1 to a 4 because we want it to start on row 4. We also want the pivot table to be created in a new sheet. So I'm going to leave that as new worksheet, and then I'm going to click OK. Notice it puts in a new sheet. The original sheet that has all the data is in sheet 1. Sheet 4 has a layout in it. If you'll notice, it tells you to build a report, choose the fields from the pivot table field list, which is over here on the right hand side. And it did not pick up on what I wanted it to. Let's close out of that. I'm going to delete this sheet and we're going to try this again. I'm going to select this A4 through G47. I must have done something wrong in there. Back to the Insert tab, Pivot Table, A4 through G47. I thought that's what I had, and then we'll click OK. Alright, now still same thing. I put a sheet in front of where our original data was, but what I was looking for on the right hand side, it did not have invoice number. It only had invoice number previously, not region, salesperson, so we were missing those fields. So something wasn't quite right with that, and you probably caught it, but you were obviously able to say anything. But anyway, so here are the fields that we have that we can generate for a pivot table. As we mentioned before, we are wanting to summarize the fitness equipment sales for, or by region I should say, and by salesperson. So we're going to be using those fields that I just mentioned there in the creation of our pivot table. So we're going to start, let's start with region. I'm just going to click on region. Notice it drops it down for row labels, which in our case that's really where we want it. Sometimes you want those to appear as columns, but we'll get to that in just a minute, and that's what the beauty is of a pivot table, is you can pivot those to columns if you need to. We're also going to grab salesperson. Click on that. That brings it down. You're not going to be able to see this very well. It's in the row labels also. Trying to make that a little bit bigger. I don't think that's going to help us, but it's listed in here. I'm just going to click the little spin box to go down. Salesperson is in the row labels. We want it to be in column labels, so I'm going to grab that, the four-sided arrow. I'm just going to click and drag salesperson up to column labels. You can see how it's put it in as columns. Okay. We also want the actual data needs to be sales. So back from the list above, we want to use the sale price. And since it is numbers, it knows to put it into the value area, which now you can see it's kind of built your pivot table. Now, just real quick here, if you wanted salespersons to be as your row, the regions to be as your column, you can certainly do that. I can pull that salesperson back down here, take region up at the top, and you can see we can get a different display. So I'm going to keep intact with what the book has though for now. And then one last thing they want us to add is the model. So up at the top I'm going to click on model. It again goes to the row labels, and we want to drag it up to the report filter so that it appears in cell A1. And these, if you look at them, are all the model numbers that we have available. Okay? So that's how you generate it. I mean, you select, we should have selected it, I think that would have made it easier. Select the area in the sheet that you want to use for your pivot table, then under insert, pivot table, that'll bring up the pivot table field list, and then you just click on the fields that you want to include in your pivot table. In project 3B, they want us to format the pivot table, and we'll also filter a little bit later on, but they're going to format first. And in order to format it, if you'll notice, if you're not inside the pivot table, you lose those contextual tabs, but as long as you're inside the pivot table, you'll have the pivot table tools options and design tab. And we want to be in the pivot table tools design tab. You'll see the pivot table styles group. I'm going to click on the drop down area, and we do want, from these have light, medium, and dark, just like all of our other styles have. We want to choose medium 2. So pivot style medium 2, and that applies some different coloring there. We also want to add banded rows. So back up at the top in the pivot table styles options group, choose banded options, and that puts in some lines down in the middle there that helps maybe to understand it a little bit better. We're going to take it a step further, and the numbers B5 through F10, if I can get all that in there, I want those to be formatted to comma with 0 decimals. So I'm going to go back to the Home tab. In the number group, we'll choose commas, and then we're going to decrease the decimals. Now, some of these still, the columns aren't wide enough. You can see that there. It's going to select those and auto fit. I think the book has you formatting those so that they're 12, but I'm just going to auto fit for now. I'll bring those over, I guess. That would help us though. Okay. Now, if that gets in your way and you're kind of done with the pivot, you can close out of that. Okay, and so you can see more of the worksheet. All right, and then in B4, B4 through F4, they want those to be right aligned. So I'm going to select those, and then the alignment group will choose right align. And that kind of aligns it with the numbers that are in their column. Okay, now in addition to formatting, we can also filter, and we're kind of familiar with filtering already, but let's say that we want to look for the sales for a group of model numbers that all start with CX. And so to do that, we're going to use the again, models. Click on the drop down arrow. There are several CXs here. You can see that. If you just click on one, though, that's the only one that you would filter out. However, if you look at the bottom, there's a select multiple items checkbox. If you click on that, that gives you checkboxes so that you could click on more if you wanted. So I'm going to click all of them that have the CX in it. And then I'll click OK. And now we're getting total amounts just for the CX items. Okay, those numbers changed. So great way to filter out the models and to see the sales for those models. Alright, and then to get them back, we can go back to the filter button. We can click on all and then click OK, and that gets back to all the models being displayed. All the sales are being displayed there as well. Okay. Just FYI, they don't really do this in the book, but you could also do this as well. The row labels, if you only wanted to see, let's say, the north regions, you could certainly do that. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. There's a list at the bottom. You're familiar with this because we've used filters in the past, but the check boxes at the bottom, you can just click on that to select all, to remove the check marks, and then just choose north and click OK, and that will display just the north's sales. And then obviously to get those back, you can clear them out. Same thing with the column labels. We could deselect and only show for Clark. Click OK. It's going to show each of the regions just the Clark sales. Okay, so it works much the same way that we've seen before with our filters. You can also filter using what they call slicers, and this is a new feature that they've added to 2010, but it allows you to filter a pivot table or a pivot chart actually without opening any of the filter drop down lists. And so anyway, it's just a way to filter without using the drop down arrows. So we're going to test that in the workbook that we're in. First of all, we need to display the slicer pane, and we're going to do it. We're going to use the same example kind of that we did previously with the models. We want to display whatever models that are necessary, but to pull that up, we're going to go to the pivot and I need to be in there. The pivot table tools option tab, and then in the sort and filter, we're going to click on insert slicer, and then the option insert slicers, and we want model. So I'm going to click on model, click OK. That brings up a pane where we could select. Let me drop down just a little bit. You can move that around. But if we want to pull up the CXS options, click on that. You can see it's changing as you choose those. Now notice you can't use multiple ones for these, so the actual filters give you a little bit more options. I'm trying to get this all out here for you. This is the same options that we saw in the filter, but it doesn't have multiple items so that you can choose multiple items to filter. So that's a disadvantage to using the slicers, but it is a quick way to filter out. And if you wanted to add an additional filter to it, let me clear this one out. If you just click on the clear filter button in the upper right hand corner, that'll get us back to the original amounts that we had previously. Okay, now if we want to have two different filters, if we want to filter by model and then also by salesperson, we can do that by adding another slicer pane. And by the way, I know we're going to use model again, but if we wanted to close out that and use different fields, we could right click on this title bar and then remove model. But we're going to use it again, so I'm going to leave it up for just a minute, and then we'll remove those in just a second. But then we also want the salesperson, so we're going to add another slicer to it. So to do that, we're going to go back to the pivot table tools options button, insert slicer again. This time we want salesperson. Click OK. Now we've got two fields going on here. So if we want to pull up, let's say Fernandez, Okay, that filters out all for Fernandez. And then filter even further by choosing VS. I guess they want the VS 2200. So now you can see only East and West regions have that, but that allows you to apply multiple filters to your data tape or your pivot table. Okay, now to get back to the way it was, again, you want to clear these filters, clicking on those, and then to remove the actual slicer windows, we can right click on the titles there and choose remove salesperson. This one will say remove model. Okay, now we can also modify the function that was applied to our sales. We looked at total sales for all the models in the various regions by salesperson, but you could also change the function used there. You could find the highest sales or the lowest or the average. In our case, our example in Project 3D, they want us to find the average for the sales. So to change the functions, you're going to go to the sum of sale price. You want to go to the field that houses that or describes your function, and then on the pivot table tools options tab, we're going to go into the field settings group, pivot table, in the active field, the active field group, and then field settings. You'll see it says sum of price there, but we'll click on field settings. The custom name, you could change that. Could now call it average sales price, and then we'll change the function in the list to average, and then click OK. Then that changes all these numbers and provides them with averages rather than sums. So it's great, lots of different ways to customize pivot tables once you get it created.